Well, last time we ended with a discussion. We were doing characteristics of the law as laid out by St. Mark. And we said the last point that we were on, which was point number 6, was the business about intercalations, which I defined as a story embedded within a story. And so it's a kind of an A structure. This is common. In the Gospel of Mark, intercalation, 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 which is, what's that? No, this is actually the standard word for this in the studies of the Gospel of Mark. Now, Mike, pursuant to your question, pursuant to your question, I haven't gotten a reply from Dennis McDonald of Claremont, who is the guy who's sort of the authority on this, but I am pursuing your inquiry, which was an important one. I did see, in looking at this, thank you, Mark, I did see that one guy was saying that this was a specifically Mark phenomenon, but I don't really believe that. One of the reasons being that this ABA ring structure you find in the Old Testament and so forth. Now, George, since you weren't here, I'll just back up 2 minutes to give you this idea of the intercalation of a story starts, another story, then the story concludes. If you think the most famous one is the story of Jairus' daughter and the woman with the issue of blood. So the father comes first, and they get going, then the woman comes, and then they go to Jairus' house. See, like that. That's in the other Gospels. But Mark has a bunch of them other than that. That's one that just, people know about. And chapter 3, relatives come to seize him. He's accused of being in league with Satan. Then his mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to take over. Chapter 6, disciples go out to extend the mission and ministry of Jesus. Death of John the Baptist. Then the disciples come back from their trip. The chief priest, chapter 14, plot to kill Jesus. The woman in Simon's house anoints him for burial. Judas then agrees to hand Jesus over. Peter's in the courtyard of the high priest. Jesus is in a hearing before the high priest. Peter then has to witness in the courtyard again. And, people have noticed this, that Mark is the only one that splits that story up. Obviously, Matthew and Luke have Peter in the courtyard and Jesus, but they do them seriatim, as you would say, one after the other. And then the one that I ended with, Jesus enters the temple after the entry into Jerusalem, and it's the only one of the Gospels that has this, with Jesus going to the temple, looking around and going out. Then you have him coming again and cursing the fig tree, 12 to 14. And then that is followed by returning to the temple and throwing out the money changers and all that. See? So you have here temple, fig tree, temple, like this. And this is as good an illustration as any of what would be called the hermeneutical significance of the intercalation. That is, the interior story illuminates the outer story. so that you know the temple is doomed because of that cursing of the fig tree. Now, it was right at the end of this that I said that we then see in chapter 11, if you take a look there, and we'll start with 20 and let's say 20 and 21. Okay, can you do that?
As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away from its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered.
Yeah, okay, so the fig tree comes up again, and here's where I'm going to write a paper like this and present it at SPM, expanding the intercalation to what I have now called the stepping stone pattern, where you don't just have A, B, A prime, but you have B prime. And when you have the stepping stone pattern, this actually focuses even more strongly on the central element of the intercalation. So, as I said last time, you know the temple is doomed and will never again function as a place. And this is the whole point. You know, you read just those verses there. If you go on, Jesus is talking about prayer and forgiveness and all the things that go on with regard to the temple. See, if the temple is gone, do those things no longer go on for the people of God? Well, Jesus' answer is, well, yeah, they still do. But now, what's your clue here? Your clue is from chapter 11. The stone that the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. Jesus is the foundation stone of the new house of God. It's not in that temple anymore. So we're calling this now the stepping stone pattern. With an increased focus on that. Now, I thought to myself in preparation for this today, it's probably right that I maybe show you at this point what would be another example of stepping stone. And this is in chapter 10. So would you all please go to that? Chapter 10. And this is a section of a pericope of this discussion after the man who's rich goes away sad and will not follow after Jesus. So now, let's do 23. Let's see, I'm going to stop you here. Let's do 23 to 25.
And Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, how difficult it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God. And the disciples were amazed at his words. But Jesus said to them again, children, how difficult it is to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God.
Okay, now, look how that went. How difficult it is, how difficult it is for a rich person. Oh, was that 20 or 21?
23 has those who have wealth enter the kingdom of God.
Well, no, but Jesus' first statement. Looking around, he said...
23. 23.
Oh, that's 23. Okay, yeah, okay. So, verse 23. And then verse 24 again?
The disciples were amazed at his words, but Jesus said to them, "Children, how difficult it is to enter the kingdom of God."
Now, what happened to the rich part about this? Okay, now all of a sudden it's how difficult it is to enter at all. That was 24, was that? Okay, and then to the next verse.
It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter.
Now we're back with the rich people again. There's your intercalation. Now read on.
And they were exceedingly astonished and said to him, "Then who can be saved?"
Well, now notice what they said. They didn't say, "How then can a rich person be saved?" They said, "Who is able to be saved? Who can enter?" And then what does Jesus say?
Jesus looked at them and said, "With man it is impossible, but not with God, for all things are possible with God."
Here you go. A, B, A prime, B prime. So it's not really about riches at all. It's about entering at all. The rich are only an example. That's all they are. But the real game in town is entering the kingdom of God. And I'm going to suggest that the translation which everybody takes, the way you've done it there, you should say with man or with God is possible.
With man it is impossible.
Yeah, that's probably not the best way to take this, but to say as far as man is concerned, it is impossible, but as far as God is concerned, all things are possible as far as God is concerned. Well, why would that be the case? As far as man is concerned, it is impossible, because we actually know we can't do it like that guy. See? But God knows we can. He can do it. Why? Because, as it says in Isaiah, the Lord looked, and there was no one to save. Then he bared his right arm. As far as he's concerned, it is possible, because he's not dependent upon what men do, but upon what he himself is doing. A great stepping stone, a great stepping stone, to show that this is not, the real question is not about the rich being saved. That's only something that's an example. The real question is, can anybody be saved? Now, by the way, you have Richard, in verse 24, do you have a variant reading? Do any of you have a variant reading in verse 24? You do?
Yeah, there's a note.
Aha!
It says, some manuscripts add, for those who trust in riches.
Right. And you can see why they would add that, because you think that's the topic, but it's not the topic. And we know that from Peter's comment and from what Jesus says later. The topic is B and the better manuscripts, B and its allies, Aleph, L, Delta, C, 565, 579, C and 33, those manuscripts, will omit that particular addition. Would you read that addition again? Read that addition again.
Some manuscripts add, for those who trust in
Who
riches.
trust in riches. Yeah. Do you have that? There's a note. There's a note there. Yeah. See, this is why. Now, by the way, let me just check mine here. Okay. Does anybody have a King James?
I have New King James.
You have a New King James?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, Marge, that's excellent, Marge. Read 24.
And the disciples were astonished at his words, but Jesus answered again and said to them, "Children, how hard it is for those who trust in riches to enter the kingdom of God."
So, the majority of manuscripts read this. This is why text criticism actually makes a difference here. When you put that in, you lose the stepping stone. And it's very, very clear what's going on here with Peter's question and Jesus' answer, because all discussion of riches had dropped away by that time, because we're back up here. Okay, so that's another example, and I'll tell you what, I mean, this is unbelievable construction on the part of Mark. It really is. And again, I say, for anyone to think that this was the simplest, the easiest, the crudest of Gospels is simply not paying attention to how this actually goes on. And remember, lots of the other two Gospels do have the stories, like Peter in the courtyard and Jesus before the Sanhedrin, but they do a much more pedestrian life. You know, they tell one story, then they tell the other story. And Mark specifically does it in such a way that the inner story illuminates the outer story. Okay? That says it's very important, this business of interrelations. All right, point number 7, and let me erase this. Point number 7 for the features is, I can testify to this, the divisions in the book are not clear or obvious. And there are all kinds of argumentations as to the so-called structure of the Gospel of Mark. And you think, then he does this. Well, go to the beginning, go to chapter 1. It's perfect. It's a perfect example. Now, in chapter 1, the question has always been around, where does the introduction end? Is it, does it end at verse 8? I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. Should you go on? And it goes to 13 with Jesus' temptation, so that 14 begins a new part, 1 verse 14. Or does it actually go through 15, so that 16 and the calling of the disciples is a new part? Now you've got people arguing about this all over the place. And it's partly, I think it's sort of clear to say that Mark simply has a kind of, somebody has described it as a musical chord construction, that if you're changing keys or something like that, unless you're doing like Schubert and going bum, bum, and just going to the new key, if you're kind of making a transition like that, it's not quite clear where the change comes exactly. And this is very characteristic, and it's characteristic of Mark being essentially composed for oral presentation. So it's really kind of odd to call this what you might say structure as such. It's not really structure, it's sort of the way the story comes at you. My favorite example of this is this. That you'll see we'll be doing the outline of the book a little bit later. But the end of section 3 is 8:22 to 26. And that is the man who, it takes Jesus 2 tries to heal the blind man. First he sees men walking around like trees, then he sees clearly, okay? So here you have a blind man. And this ends that section. Now in section 4, you have the 3 passion and resurrection predictions. And that section, section 4, ends with blind Bartimaeus. Okay? Now, what's interesting about this is you can also do it a different way. It's a giant intercalation with the 2 blind men on the outside and the passion predictions on the inside. See? Which transgresses the boundary but gives you another thing like this, Ed. Do you want to truly see? Well, then you better listen to the passion and resurrection predictions and not be worried about all kinds of miraculous, casting out of demons and walking on the water and stuff like that. You want to truly see Jesus for who he is? Listen to the passion and resurrection.
Okay, that, in my world, prior to Wagner, there's a type of analysis called Shankarian analysis. Heinrich Schenker came up with it. Where basically we take these large-scale figures, like I can take, for example, the piece that I played today, and suddenly I can reduce it to 3 chords. At 7 minutes of that, and Justin and I can talk about Shankarian analysis until the cows come home. Some of my colleagues don't at all adhere to it. But that is exactly what we're be doing. When you're talking about small-scale calculations. So in other words, if we're talking, say, a piece of height, right? You got tonic, you're going to say the dominant or subdominant, whatever, and then back. And then you see this in the microcosm, in all the small little phrases or little sections, you see that sort of thing. And basically what we reduce it, there are 3 levels in Shankarian analysis. One is the whole piece. So we have the middle ground area, and then we have the whole piece. So in other words, I can describe the first movement of a Haydn symphony as, that's just simply 1, 5, 1. Something along those, that's somewhat oversimplified, but that, I see that what you just put up there on the board, and there's also auditory. So in other words, so this is for our listening. And this and these are tricks that composers of music use.
Well, see, I want you to make these contributions to the class like this because I think the real parallel to Mark is music. It is not physical structure or something like this. But, once this guy named Brian who wrote, he used this analogy of the musical chord stuff, and I started to think, you know how much I like Haydn. You see this stuff in Haydn. Or how about the stepping stone pattern? This is exactly where Haydn does this in his second movements, where he's got this kind of a melody layout like that. He uses 2 different ones, then splits them up and does it. So these guys are just operating on a level that the rest of us are not appreciating.
Now, a question as my brain is percolating on this is, and since I do not know Greek, I know German, is there a narrative and a written differences? Say, with the German, you have the narrative, the written past versus the narrative, the spoken past tenses.
Now say that again.
In German, we have the written past tense, and then we also have a spoken past tense, which is different. In its structure. Is there a similar parallel in Greek? I'm just curious because what I'm seeing is that this is all auditory.
Well, it is, and remember, I talked last time about the use of the present tense in the historical present. This is the key for Mark, and these are all steamrolled in the translation. They're all translated as past. But when all of a sudden, Mark is doing entire present tense presentations on things, it's completely different because the thing is just kind of leaping out at you, and all of a sudden the aorist will just back that off. So, it's not sort of different versions of the same thing. He actually switches tenses in the narrative to do this kind of stuff. Yeah, but this is one of the most interesting of the issues of accordion construction or something like this. Okay. Next, number 8. Stories are often more full and kind of action-packed than they are in the other Gospels. I would fuller stories, I'll put that. I will hazard to say that, George, remember when we were growing up, how you'd have these illustrated Bible storybooks, okay? Well, any story you know from the Gospels that is sort of action-packed about Jesus is probably from the Gospel of Mark. Let me give you an example of this. Now, would you go please to chapter 5 of Mark. And we're going to go into the center of the intercalation with the woman with the issue of blood. Starting with verse 9, I'm in chapter 5, starting with verse 25 through 34. You have a reading of that?
And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was filled with her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about to the crowd and said, who touched my garment? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around, and yet you say, who touched him? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace.
Right, now that's the story as you know it. Before we move on to something else, I want to tell you the incredible high tension construction of this in the original. It starts with Mark stringing together 7 participles. There is no other place in the Bible that does this. The woman being in a flow of blood for 12 years and having suffered many things by many doctors and having spent all of her possessions and not having been aided, but rather having come to a worse place and having heard concerning Jesus and having come up in the crowd behind him, I mean, you can just see that with this stringing of the 7 participles, what would you say? The agony of her life is actually being depicted in front of you. Then, you have later on, and immediately, look at verse 30. What kind of a thing is this? And immediately Jesus, upon knowing that power had gone out from him, bzzz, you know, what? Turning around the crowd, proceeded to say, who touched my garments? And his disciples began to say, see the crowd pressing in on you and you say, who touched me? And he kept on looking around to see who it was. I mean, this is sort of genius scene construction here. All right, now, I want you to see, Mark's given you the full meal deal. You want to see just a little snack version? Go to Matthew 9. You've just heard it. You've heard the 7 participles. Jesus, power is going out from him. He's looking around. The disciples are getting upset with it. Now, go to Matthew 9. Starting with verse 20, 22, read please.
And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will be made well. Jesus turned and seeing her, he said, take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well.
Where's the rest of the story? See, Mark's the shortest of the Gospels, but the longest of the periods. It's like this, you have the same thing. This is the best illustration. We have another one almost as good, with the man let down on the pallet through the roof. Well, all that stuff about unroofing the roof and the pallets coming down and the crowds around, all that kind of stuff, that's all in Mark. You read Matthew, kind of nothing's going on, you know? So, this is really where you get, as I say, kind of a full meal deal. And I think that this reflects what I said to you guys at the beginning when we listened to what Papias said in the early part of the 2nd century, when he said Mark was the interpreter of Peter, and he laid out what Peter did while he was preaching. You know, this is probably the kind of thing you do when you are telling the story. Okay, number 9. And, to be honest with you, that's just astonishing, the difference between those 2 versions of this. That the version of Mark with the 7 participles and Jesus kind of getting all jazzed and, the disciples interacting with him and everything like that, that is just stunning, I think. Yeah.
Well, this particular to me, it's always been interesting, this connection that when you take introduction to writing anything, simplify it. Don't have sentences that string out and now hang and all that sort of stuff forever. It is, and yet in the Greek, better than many of us here, the participle, places the participle and the participle and so forth, before you get to the verb, it nails it down. How do you resolve that? Is it a thing that, English simply isn't capable of doing what it is Greek?
I think there's maybe a difference in oral presentation. When Michael Ziegler, who's now the speaker of the Lutheran, actually, when he does this part of the Mark performance, he does it just the way I did it. That's where I picked it up from. The woman's coming along, and he goes along like this with the 7 participles, and says, and you can kind of see this thing. I think there's just such a difference between, we are so used to reading silently. Just remember, reading silently is a late phenomenon. It's a late phenomenon. Everybody read out loud, and it was unusual in the ancient world if you didn't read out loud. I don't know where it is, but one of my Latin teachers, I remember, so that would be John Franz, told the story that there's a place in Cicero where he says to some guy in a letter, I came to visit you, you were reading Virgil, and I knew you had a cold. Well, why? Because he's reading out loud, and you could tell when he was reading like that. Now, the person who is the most famous person for reading silently, because it was so unusual, was St. Ambrose. So, when Augustine went to see St. Ambrose, which was one of those great connections, Augustine and Ambrose, it's kind of like Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, some of these great minds coming together. But when Augustine went to see Ambrose, he commented on the fact that he read silently. So, this means that if you're reading, and one of the reasons that you read out loud is because if you were reading Greek, remember there were no divisions in the words in the sentences. So that if you have that's the beginning of the Gospel of John. En arche ein ho logos. In the beginning was the Word. En arche ein ho logos. But it's written like that. So, in order for you to get a handle on it, you read out loud because en arche, you start to hear the words. Maybe this is the way to say it. You hear the words beginning to form as you do it. When I've read manuscripts, the physical manuscript, I always read out loud as I'm doing it. It's the only way you get a handle on it. Otherwise, you're just looking at this kind of mass of letters like this. Right. So I would say, coming back to the great question here, I would say that a lot of this has to do with the continuation of orality. Okay? So you basically have this progress of medium, if I may put it this way. You have orality, then you have writing, then you have printing, which is not the same as writing, printing. And now people have said, we are returning with videos and stuff to a second or a secondary orality. This is why actually public performance, like of the Gospel of Mark, has such an incredible impact, especially with young people, because they're just not as comfortable reading for long periods silently and so forth. So basically, while you have this stage here, orality is still riding along with it. And it's partly riding along because you're reading out loud. And see, I would say that if you want to say about that today, this is still riding along. Nobody has just gone that nobody will read anything anymore. This, by the way, is a kind of an analysis of Tom Boomershine. but it started with a guy named Walter Ong, who was at the University of St. Louis University. Now, it's Tom Boomersheim then who said that at each stage, different hermeneutical principles sort of arose. So that when you got to the stage of writing, then allegory starts. Because you have a set text that you are working on, and you're trying to get that text to speak today. Well, there aren't any modifications on the telling because the text is set. So you start doing allegories on the text. The historical critical method arises with the age of printing. Because only in the age of printing do you have the possibility of having exact copies and preparations. I've said this many times before in this class, and it's very important. And all the people who read Christian news and a lot of stuff in there are kind of getting this next point, which is, up until the middle of the 15th century, nobody had anything except individual manuscripts. And every manuscript was different. Every manuscript was different. Sometimes greatly so, sometimes not so. So, if somebody said something like, well, what do you have as a text? I'm talking about you live in 1395. What's the text of the Gospel of Matthew? God's going to have to take a couple of manuscripts and throw them on under that floor. Now you got to try to figure out what that is. See? So it's really only after the advent of printing that you start having these super critical analyses of text and the rise of the historical critical method, and I might say, the rise of the notion of inerrancy. See, it's that notion of inerrancy is sort of at the mercy of you being able to have exact copies of everything all the time. I'm not sure that the notion arises all that easily when every copy you have is different. So it's going to be interesting here what happens. And I think what you see happening, and I've talked to Tom Boomersheim about this over the years, and he's still kind of unsettled in his own mind about what sort of hermeneutical move are you going to have in the 21st century. So if you have the move to allegory here, the move to historical criticism here, I think what's starting to happen is it's kind of returning here where you have no set text. So somebody puts a text on the internet and all of a sudden it gets changed. If you do an internet citation, you have to put down something like this. Access March 10th, 2019. Why? Might be different what's out there tomorrow. And you don't know that. So, I think the authority of text as such is being called into question. I'm not sure how this, where this is all going to go. This is why I go to all these crazy sessions at Society of Biblical Literature. This is kind of see what's happening, what people are saying. Mike, there's just got to be this incredible comparison to music, where you had music, then you have stuff written down, then you have copies being made by hand. Well, then later had printed copies. But they have different editions of printed copies and stuff. But if you are doing performance, which is like orality. See, Judy and I were privileged last year, so it's about a year ago, to hear what I consider to be the finest musical performance I have ever heard in my life anywhere. We were at La Chapelle in Paris, and it was a performance of Vivaldi's Four Seasons in this unbelievable chapel, and this guy is putting on this show that is irrepeatable, unrepeatable. Now, what does Vivaldi's Four Seasons actually sound like? Depends on what performance you go to, you know. But I think the parallel to music and biblical literature is really pretty profound, because you've got a performance of the text, a performance of music. I mean, look what you do in choir when we're talking about, okay, now we're like you often say, I'm not trying to go to the races on this. We're going to slow this thing down. All right? Well, all of a sudden it's different than if it's way faster. So, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, a lot of it, as far as, you know, if we would jump back in time, first of all, you know, I think we as a society, you know, particularly on the little timeline there, we were more with the flaps of skin on our ears than with our eyes. And we have, over time, become much more visually oriented society than auditorily oriented. And I see that, or hear that, I hear that in some, when I'm judging, you know, the National Organ Planning Competition. Because a lot of times you hear kids who are technically unbelievable. I mean, the playing is just, the technique that's being displayed just blows my mind. But it's absolutely without what I call music. So, you know, sometimes when I'm judging sheets, my shorthand notes are notes without song or notes without music.
Yeah.
Because it's this machine gun fire coming out. So, I mean, you know, I think a lot of it has to deal, or a lot of the weight on, for example, this Markian gospel would be on the performer, because I think that this was meant to be heard, not meant to be seen.
Yeah, right.
And because it's meant to be heard, it's my job as the performer to communicate this, whether it's this textual idea, this musical idea, to you, the audience, who don't have the insight. So, like when you were doing last week, when you were doing the first, the beginning of Mark, all of a sudden, holy crap, I never thought of it like that. But see, if you read it, you don't see it. You know, it's not, that wasn't intended for the vision, it was intended for the ears. I mean, it was, but the whole empathy thing completely on, it's like, wow, that really is profound.
Yeah,
you know, this whole faith comes by hearing thing. I mean, it's almost like the intention was, it is intended to be done verbally or acoustically, as opposed to be done just through reading squiggles on a piece of page. Because I think we're missing a lot based on just this stuff here. Because once I start hearing it, but like I said, when you introduced Mark last week, that superimposition of intercalation was like, oh my gosh. Then you go back, you can see it after you've heard it.
You can see it after you've heard it.
I mean, there's a lot of things like that when I'm playing, you know, after you've heard it, it's like, oh.
Yeah. Well, now, see, I don't think, Richard, this is where I get in trouble with the really conservative elements of our sin, okay? I don't think that this is particularly bad, like what Mike is saying. See, I just think of this. Think of Deuteronomy. What does God say to the people? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. He doesn't say, look, O Israel. He doesn't say, think about it, O Israel. Cogitate on it, O Israel. He says, hear, O Israel. So the hearing is in many ways the dominant sense as far as God is concerned. And this move, people lament as if there's some sort of objectivity or something in this, but that's not the case. That's not the case. And you're going, as people start listening again, I think we're going to recapture something very valuable, because if you're just looking at squiggles on the page, to use your phrase, you're sort of looking at a cadaver. You're not actually seeing the thing come to life. Yeah, you're not seeing that, Mark.
That's okay. This is why I am not a proponent of the readings being printed out.
Oh, absolutely.
I do not follow them, because if I am following them,
Right.
and you say Jesus instead of Christ, which is what I see,
Yeah.
then I have missed something, because I think, oh, you didn't read what was there.
Yeah.
So I never follow along. And that's why I always tell the readers, make sure that you are speaking slowly in our sanctuary and distinctly, because I am just listening.
Absolutely.
I'm not following along.
Well, you can ask my dear wife. I never read along, do I? I absolutely
I don't
not. Put it aside. I think what should happen is, sometimes people say, well, I take the lessons home and look at them later. Then hand them out at the back of the church after the service. But listen to the readings and let the stuff kind of wash over you. Marge, that is 100% correct.
Well, the other thing is, I think, it's a physiological thing too, because when we read, we tend to start going into speed mode and skim through.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
we're in a hurry to get it done. Because we've got this built-in, at least I do, have this built-in impatience with, well, But if I'm reading something, I become somewhat impatient.
Yeah.
With it. So if I was reading about the woman, boom, I would just sort of skim through.
Yes, skim through that first
It
part.
would have been, for me, my reading of Mark, I would have come away with Matthew's
Right.
account. Because to me, that was just fluff. But see, when it's done auditorily, because you're engaging your listeners, whether it's at a campfire or whether it's here or wherever,
Right.
All of a sudden you're moving in our minds this image. And you can take your time, because we're like hearing these words, because it takes us longer to process those words here than it does through my eyes. And so suddenly you have a captive audience. Now you can sort of really stress the predicament this person was in. I didn't see the predicament in Matthew.
No.
I heard it when you did it in Mark.
Right.
And that's a completely different way, and that deals with our perceptions.
It is interesting when we do the Mark performance, how riveting it actually is. If you look at the audience, they're not fooling around or looking at the phones or, kind of looking at the ceiling or something. No. They're really focused on what's happening. So, by the way, Marge, this is why I know Doug takes real care and is concerned about what the field workers do as far as reading. This is critical because you are reading the text out and bringing it to life, and it's not your words, it's the text words. You're kind of the medium to bring that to life. Yeah.
I wanted to circle back to the question that started this, whether English is different. And I want to summarize what you said by saying English is not different from any of this. English is not different, that we cannot, do not apply different ways of thinking to ancient texts or other modern texts.
Yeah.
If you go back to Shakespeare could have some very convoluted sentences.
Yeah.
Orators from the 18th and 19th centuries in America and England. So in English could speak for hours on something building up. So it's not the language It's just that in this particular period of history in which we live, we don't do that.
James Madison wrote very complicated sentences.
And the whole idea of ABA structure, if you listen, although Garrison Keillor is no longer telling the stories, they've all begun to start recollections and go off to Anderson's, come back to the nuts. That is a very good storytelling, and you find it in good storytelling. And so, even English.
You find it actually in sermons where a guy will start out with a story and then he'll come back to the story at the end. That is exactly right. Now, one of the reasons that ABA structure works, let's just say is effective, is that it helps the orator. So if you're doing a ring structure like that, it helps the orator. It goes, well, I'm on B prime now, and then I go to A prime, and the thing lays out in a way that becomes a memory aid. And I think that that's actually, fairly important. Right. Okay. Well, listen, I'll tell you what. George, thank you for that. That was No. This is... Why do you think it took me 18 years to do math? Because all of a sudden you get into these sock gossip, and but all these topics are important in order to see the stuff. Right, number 9. There is a noticeable concern in this gospel with purity. This is a big surprise because it's the gospel of action. Everybody knows that. Except the spirits that oppose Jesus are called unclean spirits. Unfortunately, the NIV, up until a very recent iteration, maybe 5 years ago, the NIV kept translating this as evil spirits. Well, it's not evil, it's unclean. And we'll talk about that in more detail. Let me simply say now, the reason it's called that is that those who are washed and receive the Spirit are clean. They're under the reign and rule of God. Those that are not washed and in the power of the Spirit are unclean and outside the reign and rule of God. So it's not that Mark's use of clean and unclean doesn't have to do with, no, let me put it the other way. He doesn't use evil because it's not a matter of good and bad. It's a matter of, are you in the kingdom under the reign and rule of God, or are you not? Now, so as I said, the NIV's really been bad about this. This becomes really obvious in chapter 7. So Jesus is doing all this stuff in chapter 6. You got the death of John the Baptist, then Jesus is feeding the 5,000, he's walking on the water and everything, like excoriating the disciples again. And then all of a sudden, wham! This thing stops and they have this big discussion about eating with unwashed hands and the whole problem with impurity and Jesus purifying all things and so on. So this is a feature of the narrative, the plot of the narrative of Mark. 10, Jesus is abandoned and alone at the end of the story. Everybody leaves him. The disciples leave him. He cries from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is a very stark portrayal of the crucifixion that is quite different from the Gospel of Luke. You'll hear that this year in Series C. Because in Series C, Jesus on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. It's a completely different image. It's a heroic image. When you're preaching Mark, you are preaching Jesus truly being abandoned with the sin of the world upon him. That is not Luke's picture. Luke is not intended to make that point. Mark makes that. And then I'll do this, and then we'll end this part of the introduction. Point 11. And this is the most important thing in the whole gospel. The words of Jesus always come to pass and are true. Of course, there are the three passion and resurrection predictions, 8:31, 9:31, 10:33, and 4. But Jesus predicts that when the two disciples go into the city before Palm Sunday, they'll find a cold tide, and it's true. In chapter 14, he tells the disciples to go in, prepare the Passover, and he says, you'll see a guy will meet you carrying a jar of water, and it is true. He predicts that all the disciples will fall away. Peter says, I'm not going to, and it is true. And this is the secret to the end of the thing, which we'll talk about in a week or so. He says in chapter 14, verse 28, after I arise, I will go before you into Galilee. And that, too, is true. Because that's exactly what the young man at the tomb says to the women. In chapter 16, verse 7. He is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he is. That's the point of the Gospel of Mark, is the surety of the word of promise. The surety of the word of promise. It's not the point of the Gospel of John. Gospel of John, you see it all. Gospel of Luke, you see it all. But the Gospel of Mark is the Gospel that portrays the story of Jesus as you experience it. What do you have? You have promise. Jesus' word always comes to pass. This is the key to the whole thing. And I might just say as my last point this morning, this is why anybody who thinks, stop reading Christian news, anybody who thinks that there's something improper about the ending of the Gospel of Mark at 16:8 isn't paying attention, because it's not about what you see in the Gospel of Mark, it's what you listen to. And that's the young man's words to the women at 16 verse 7. That's all. Whole point of this gospel. The whole point of this gospel. Okay, well, listen, we finished here with 11 features of the plot. I'll talk about the next time. I'm going to talk about the outline, and then in preparation for going verse by verse, after I talk about the outline, I'm going to take you, so bring some paper next time if you want, and for this, I'm going to try to take you through the whole narrative at one fell swoop, so you kind of see the whole story, and then we dive in depth at all the parts. Okay? Okay, any final questions or anything? Mike, thanks for those contributions on music. It's fantastic. Let's close with prayer. Lord God, Heavenly Father, as in this Lenten season we walk with your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Keep us faithful to his word, that word of promise which is always sure and which will guide us to the end. Okay, thanks a lot.